Hi, this is Paul. I've still got Scott Adams in my feed, even though I never watch his videos unless a whole bunch of you will say, oh, you got to see this, and then I'll go look it up because I use you to filter the internet. I really do, because if enough of you think it's important, then I've got the algorithm plus you, and I find value in the algorithm and I find value in you. So we had this video streamed live 23 hours before I made this clip, which was probably about, 7 o'clock this morning. I made the little still. How to save the world and why Biden might not be a part of it. And I just erased all the Biden stuff because to me, politics is now and religion is always, and politics is never as interesting to me as religion. What are we talking about when we talk about saving the world? It's this phrase that we use. I'm not sure we know anything. I'm not sure we have any kind of agreement about what it means. And so I want to do a little bit of thinking about that. So I made this PowerPoint, and from this PowerPoint, I'll make this video. Now, I think Scott Adams is a smart guy. I actually started following Scott Adams after Trump was elected because he was one of these lefty types who said, oh, Trump's going to win. And then he's had quite his own journey through this. He's really sort of IDW in that he's a former progressive modernist atheist turning more conservative. And although with Scott Adams, you never know if it's part of his hypnotism thing or what. But, Scott Adams is who Scott Adams is, and sometimes he makes good points. He already has status and money, but now with social media, he's making himself more famous and richer still. Now, a big part of what I think people mean by saving the world is prevent the world from getting worse. And Jordan Peterson, part of the reason he is so popular is because he's got a way of stating what's semi-obvious in a way that it's like, oh yeah, that was always there. Why didn't I just put that out in front of me and think about it that way? He said, you can always make things worse. And that's true. And it's not a small or unremarkable thing that we don't make things worse. We make a lot of things worse too, but this is a classic Jordan B. Peterson point. That is one level obvious, but on another level almost always overlooked. Now, this is true individually, communally, and globally. And this is where I sort of get my dead reckoning, better, worse type morality filter that we all sort of use. And there are some really bad things like the Second World War that contribute to some really good things. And we live in this world in that way. And as a pastor, I regularly have it with people that will claim, this horrible thing happened to them, but because of this horrible thing, this really good thing happened to them. And then people want to jump in and ask questions about, well, does it justify it? And it's like, that's the wrong way of approaching it. That the good thing doesn't really justify the bad thing. You have the bad thing and the good thing, and you're really happy about the good thing, and you're really sad about the bad thing, but your life has both of them. And a key aspect of Christian pastoral care is encouraging people to believe that God can take bad things and make truly great things out of it. And you'll hear me making the points about glory, how in many ways glory is enhanced and meaning is enhanced and magnified by suffering. So I think about Gandalf's quip, even the wise can't see all ends. Now, Jordan Peterson is actually on this type of thing quite a bit. If you go all the way back to towards the beginning of the second wave is really season 4, episode 5. He had really quite a good conversation with Matt Ridley on pessimism, and they go through all of the different reasons why we tend to have a bias that way. Our salience hierarchies prioritize opportunities and obstacles. You can get that from Jordan's class lectures. Now, this is very dead reckoning, and we know this, but this is true of us individually and maybe I'll say collectively instead of communally. We prioritize the now and the proximate at the expense of the communal and the future. And when we recognize the downfall, it reinforces rationality and other tools. And so, it's the classic Homer Simpson trying to, if you mix that vodka with the mayonnaise and you drink it all up now, sure don't want to be tomorrow's Homer. Yeah, I get that. And so we try to use rationality to sort of short circuit the proximal nature of the dead reckoning, A/B testing, good bad stuff that we do. But rationality is not as powerful a system as we imagine it to be. That was really one of the themes underlying Jordan's recent conversation with Clay Rutledge that I don't think has gotten enough play. I looked at it. It wasn't quite the video that I really wanted to do a full-scale blow-by-blow response video to or reaction video to, but there's a ton of good stuff in it. Whether or not I do a commentary video on something is also always a function of what's going on in my life if I have the time right now. Although, yeah, the Bishop Barron, Vervaeke, Peugeot, Peterson video, I will do that video. There's no question I'm going to do that video. But rationality is not as powerful a system as we imagine it to be, because we are not as powerful as we imagine ourselves to be. Oh, if I can only have... I've told you the story again about my wife's aunt who used to brag back in the 80s when she heard that crack cocaine, once you took one hit, you'd be addicted for life. And she would always brag about the fact that she has a pretty strong will. And so she thinks that if she took a hit of crack cocaine, that she could resist it. And I would always sort of smile, because, well, she did have a pretty strong will, but she had botched a bunch of things up in her life anyway, and that's kind of how we are. And I sort of, in a trollish way, wanted to go and get her some crack cocaine and say, here, why don't you try it? But she was a fundamentalist conservative Baptist, and, she wouldn't touch it. She was the kind of person who would go to a coffee shop and order a cup with hot water and bring her own tea bag and feel herself very pleased with herself when she got out of there. Maybe if she was feeling generous, leave a 25-cent tip. That was who she was. But I always think about her with this idea of rationality and will, that somehow we imagine if we know the right thing to do, we can do it. And to me, if you're a biblicist, that's easily dispelled with Romans 7. People who abandon rational religion for rationalism aren't anywhere near as rational as they imagine themselves to be, especially as a group. Well, that just reminds me of a little bit from today's. So I'm announcing that the Grim Grizz channel is my new favorite. I did that in the previous video too, but not everybody watches all of them. It's my new favorite YouTube channel. It's my new favorite YouTube channel. Might be as big an honor as you think, because these things can change from week to week. But I think he's doing some really good stuff. And here's an example.
Welcome to This Is It and Dust to Dust. Welcome. Thanks for being here. I like it. We want what's best for you. Remember, there is no agency. And also, remember, embody. Remember to embody. Okay, now back to the beast and the bicameral mind. Can you control your appetite? Would you know if you fasted? If you can't control your appetite, is it really yours? What is it? What is this parts of you that you can't control? Like your heartbeat and these other things. Is it just the animal meat sack body you've been born into?
This vague accent that Grimm has, maybe he's been sent from Russia to America to colonize me personally. Maybe Grim Grizz is Putin's tool to get under my skin. And now that he's become my favorite YouTube channel, it's happening.
Is it the beast? Are you an angel sent down from heaven to elevate a beast? I think everybody has especially atheists, have a really, really inaccurate understanding of faith. And I don't know, I guess everything I do is shadow shit. But so to me, I think you're constantly faithing. It's like the way your heart beats is you have faith in things. You need to. It's like those are mental constructs that you put your faith into. No, it's like for the longest point, like a really long time in my life, I was If I only had the faith of a mustard seed, like if I had poured the faith that I always naturally produce was going into the belief that I didn't have enough faith. So you see, I don't know. That's so. But anyway, I think faith is just something that's constantly happening, and like you can maybe direct it consciously, but I think most of it happens in the shadows, in your map of reality. I think that's yeah. It's a thing you direct. Anyway, that's faith. We're doing the beast in the bike.
And I think that actually is a terrific observation, an important point. So rationality is not as powerful as you think it is. We aren't anywhere near as rational as we imagine ourselves to be, and I think a lot of the work of Clay Rutledge just drives that point home. And this is especially true of us when we're in groups. We tend to default back to older forms of intuitive mass communal dead reckoning, which I think really make up a lot of folk religions and folk aspects of traditional religions. Someone on Twitter, with Symbolic Mimes, pointed out the climate confessional booth. It's like, well, there it all is. Our rationality is always dependent upon both the selection and the limits of the data available to us. Proximity of threat bias doesn't really go away individually and collectively. And we have communal politics to deal with some of the threat. But that then requires communal action, and we're all over the map with it. And if you want an example of that, just look at everything that's happened with COVID all over the place. I mean, can you find any one human being that says, I'd really like to get COVID and I think it's a good idea if everyone does? No, it's not what people are going to think. But how bad is it? What to do about it? What collective action we should do? It's sort of the definition of the word crisis. Now, the Enlightenment really reshapes everything. Over the weekend, Job asked me if I'd ever read Karl Barth's commentary on Romans, and I had not. And on the question and answer, someone asked, how much do you know of Karl Barth? Not a lot. And so actually this weekend I picked up a couple books. One book was on, this one didn't have Barth in it, but Theologians Under Hitler. And the introduction to it had a really nice walking through of a lot of big purview history. And another armchair theologian looks at Karl Barth, something like that. The title was. I think I've got the title later on in this video. But modernity, Industrial Revolution, all brought on a new optimism in terms of what human institutions can achieve. And we're still living in the afterglow of that optimism. And I think about Peterson's assessment of Jung, that basically Jung said that towards the end of the Middle Ages, there was some sort of collective disappointment in what Christianity had wrought in Europe. And so we sort of turned to alchemy. And out of alchemy came the science. It's sort of a rough summary of what I heard Peterson say. So, it's very interesting in my conversation that I posted today. I'm recording this on Monday. I think I'll probably release this on Wednesday. In my conversation with Jason, it was quite interesting. His dissatisfaction with institutions. And he's by no means alone. My wife and I we're always house hunting on weekends. Why? I'm not sure. We've been doing this for years. Someday we'll move, but prices have gotten crazy, but it's kind of a nice way for my wife and I whenever I got to buy a new car, we always enjoy car shopping together. So why not enjoy house shopping together? We visit open houses and think about if we downsized or upsized or changed or moved or whatever, or how could we improve our house, yada, yada, yada. So we're always doing that. But, I distracted myself and I lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, I was telling the story about a realtor in one of the open houses. And so we go into the open house and we start talking, and someone at church here They hadn't gotten the new alarm code. They set off the alarm. The alarm company called me. We were about an hour out of town. I live quite close to church. Usually I can just buzz down and take care of things like that. I can't. I have to call another member of the church to come down to church to check on, yada, yada, yada. Big. But meanwhile, we're at this open house. And of course, then that outs me as a pastor. And then once you get outed as a pastor, well, now we're going to have another conversation about this. And then we started talking to the open house because nobody was coming into this open house. And it was way out in the middle of nowhere. And it was lovely. And we'll never buy it. But there we were. And so then talked to her about Christianity, blah, 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 blah. And she's a Christian and her kids and her blended family and blah, 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 blah. And then I said, because she told me what area of the Sacramento region she lived in. And I said, well, what church do you go to? Because I know some churches and some pastors in that area. And she said, she didn't go to church. Oh, that's interesting. And not unusual, but why not? And for many of the reasons that Jason had. And so I have these conversations all the time. Just because I do them on the internet doesn't mean this is where I started having them. Anyway, in a rational-ish, organized way, these tools that we have created, just made this video up. Oh, I should probably play it. I was watching the Rebel Wisdom video this morning where they were talking about Facebook and Meta, and Alexander said this, which just really caught my attention. So I made, a little clip for it and posted it on Twitter and shared it with others.
There is this theme as well, I think, in sci-fi, and I wonder we've seen it with our technology already, is that we have these utopian technologies that could open the world and connect us like the internet was, that eventually when you add humans into it, we fuck it all up by being human.
And it's as if the technology came down from the gods and we messed it up. It's the story of Prometheus and fire. It's all over the place. And we have all this power, and what do we do with this power? We do destructive things with this power. And we see this when we talk about professionalism. So what do? We colonize people into fulfilling certain expectations. This is all part of modernity and the industrialized world. And so in a rationalish, organized way, these tools afford us a hedge against individual biases and vices, professionalism, and greatly multiply our power in the social, political, and physical realms. Now, this is all over the project of the vision of Sam Harris. This is how we save the world. This is how we keep from making it worse, because we're tremendously impressed at our capacities when we organize ourselves and have all of these management by outcome decisions and put things together and look at what we can produce and look at what we can change and look at what we can do. But of course, all along the way, there's all of these unintended consequences and waste and, people getting hurt along the way. I mean, we know this, and we've known this since the Industrial Revolution has come about. We're sort of trying to keep everything from making it worse. That's how we're saving the world. And we imagine that whatever moral assumptions we bring about, well, this is just good and bad sort of wrapped up from the dead reckoning, which is basically exactly Sam Harris's argument about morality being based on well-being. He's just ramping up dead reckoning all the way to the top and says, well, it can get all the way to the top. And, well, you really can't... It really can't work, as many has complained, and Mueller in his video about Sam Harris and the absolutizing. Well, I think that's right. But that's a lot of our vision of saving the world. It also has a navigation problem, and it gets what usually happens, as I point out again and again and again and again, as Tom Holland has pointed out much better than I have, is you just keep smuggling in Christian moral assumptions. While at the same time you're saying, no, this is from an Enlightenment clean room. No Christianity here. This is all strictly moral rationalism. It's like, I don't know. I don't know how you can continue to buy that. It's just scaling up of the proximate pitfall. Okay. It's biased towards threat avoidance, individualism, and collective. And suffering avoidance is totalizing, and it's bloated into the essence of morality. And that's a lot of what we're seeing, and that's actually, I think, a lot of our problem. I made the point with my conversation with Greg about this video a while ago where you have children and chimps and they're doing this little puzzle to figure out how to get the treat. And the children, in fact, imitate everything. And the chimp has a little bit of relevance realization and doesn't imitate everything. And so is the chimp smarter, or does the child actually know what the child doesn't know? We all know rationally, intuitively that much productivity and progress requires suffering and sacrifice, but suffering avoidance has nearly become the definition of morality in some cases. But individually and collectively, we must suffer in order to progress and to produce and to achieve. Suffering is sort of in an opponent process with effort. On one hand, we all want to minimize our efforts, and that makes sense rationally in many respects. On the other hand, we want to know what suffering is required, so we have the relevance realization to it, and we're sort of always at play with that. And so then we sort of jigger the whole equation by saying useless suffering. But part of the problem is we don't know what suffering is useless, and we don't know what suffering is productive. In other words, all this dead reckoning, this A/B testing down below with respect to suffering, won't necessarily tell us too much. And you see this all the time in any field that actually requires a lot of development and time. We sort of account for it with this phrase, paying our dues. I mean, he's paid his dues. What does that mean? He's worked his way up in the corporation, and he knows that at every level, he paid his dues or she paid her dues. We say that all the time. It's hard to know whether or not suffering is useless. Again, one of my famous takeaway points from Jordan Peterson is this relationship between sacrifice, suffering, and the future. Delayed gratification. We sacrifice in order to create a future. This was from his video from April 2018. I remember that because he was in the same place when we had our conversation. Secular modernist progressives know this, sort of, but again, we're not smart enough, we don't know enough, we don't see enough to actually know everything so that we can sort of answer all of these questions with rationality. So then what we sort of do is use marketplace dynamics, which is in many respects politics, in order to sort of grope our way into the future. Now, the woke religion is a justification system for prioritizing some suffering while others over others in order to achieve a certain future for less unjustifiable suffering. For example, you can tick off everybody in your workplace with your wokish stuff, but all the people who are ticked off with your wokish stuff have to keep their mouths shut because, boy, their suffering is justifiable, and the other suffering that your wokish system is trying to eliminate, well, that's unjustified suffering. And so there again, as much as they don't like a hierarchy, they have indeed established one, and that hierarchy is functioning sort of in the marketplace of morality. But how well do these wokish schemes work? Rod Dreher had a little conference here in Sacramento that I attended, and he did some of his stuff from the Benedict option and Live Not by Lies. And in Live Not by Lies, he's really got a terrific chapter in that book on suffering. And what modernist secular morality has sort of done in sort of their dead reckoning way is say, well, suffering is bad. They're a lot weaker on what suffering is justifiable and healthy and what suffering is unjustifiable. That, in fact, is what creates a moral hierarchy. But to the degree that wokeism is socialist, they are seriously, there are serious concerns that suffering avoidance actually produces more unproductive suffering. It produces systems in which people don't want to speak the truth. In fact, people will lie as a community in order to avoid little sufferings, but then what you actually create is a much larger situation with a lot more suffering. And that's sort of where we're at with political correctness and safety culture and all of these sorts of things. And Benjamin Boyce, when this story broke of, now, a $1.4 million house doesn't get you as much house as you think it will, especially in a place like Los Angeles. So we'll cut her a little bit of slack, but this goes on to make my point. I mean, Benjamin Boyce had the best line in that Black Lives Matter. A tell on the weakness of the woke revolution is that it does not manage suffering and sacrifice as well as older religious systems that weren't simplistic about it. In other words, I was just, I'm going to have to get that book, Vatican I. You wouldn't believe how much money I spend on books. Might have been Tim DeRoche that recommended this book to me on Audible. It's free on Audible if you have, I don't know if it's just free on Audible period or it's free on Audible if you have an Audible subscription, but I've been listening to it on Audible and really enjoying it. Catholicism and the Century of Lights. In Catholic areas of Europe in 1869, that's not that long ago, on the eve of the Council of Vatican, the First Vatican Council, the churches were full. Men, women, and children participated with obvious sincerity in a rich variety of religious devotions, including public processions and pilgrimages to local shrines. New religious orders of women had sprung up, and vocations to the priesthood were plentiful. Nuns and priests were leaving Europe in large numbers to spend their lives in foreign missions, usually with little prospect of ever returning home. The woke are not that committed. I remember Jordan Peterson's conversation with the woman from GQ in the UK, and he quite rightly asked her, well, if you're so concerned about black folks getting jobs, why don't you give your job up so a person of color can have your job? She's like, I like my job. And it's like, duh. It's just not a serious religion. And when you read something like this, such phenomena were not deceptive. Almost everywhere the Catholic Church found itself, it showed remarkable vigor. In 1870, the Church numbered perhaps as many as 200 million people, of whom 3/4 lived in Europe. Think about that. That's not that long ago. Membership was especially concentrated in 4 areas: France, Italy, Austria-Hungary, and the Iberian Peninsula. Around 37.5 million Catholics in a total population of 38 million. France was the strongest Catholic nation. By mid-century, it sent 2/3 of all missionaries leaving Europe. 2 decades later, it numbered 1 nun in every 350 inhabitants of the country. Think about that. 2 decades later, it numbered, although sharply divided ideologically, France led the church in new Catholic initiatives, which flowed from there to the rest of the church. But Spain, Italy, and the traditionally Catholic areas of German-speaking lands, the population showed themselves similarly devoted to their Catholic heritage and ready to meet the challenges of the day. And they did so sacrificially. And, this is, again, part of the point that I make, and having grown up in a very religious community, when people pursued their vision of the good to save the world, they did so at great personal expense. Part of the reason I'm not as panicky as this woke revolution is I think they're not even as serious as many other political revolutions that were in the early and middle 20th century. These people are Americans. They like good things and they expect good things, and they don't expect their politics or their religion to cost them much of anything. And that's very true of a lot of people in the church as well. They don't expect their religion to cost them much as anything. Their religion has to be all upside and no downside, and they're willing to argue for it, to posture for it, to maybe go out in the street if it feels good. But in terms of real sacrifice, I haven't seen a lot. So I'll read it again. A tell on the weakness of the woke revolution is that it does not manage suffering and sacrifice as well as older religious systems that weren't so simplistic about it. Afterlife reward and punishment is powerful. It's a powerful aspect that secular systems really can't employ. And I think that's part actually of their weakness. And it's part of sort of how secularism dilutes and weakens religious traditions. Now, there's a real impotence around catastrophe avoidance that people have noted in terms of climate change and COVID and all sorts of catastrophes that come our way. Now, if you have a war where your cities are going to get bombed or you're going to get nuked, well, that tends to mobilize people pretty quickly. 9/11 tended to mobilize people pretty quickly. But stuff that's for the most part sort of theoretical and not terribly proximate, we don't really rally ourselves very well for world saving, partly because many of the things that we have to do aren't terribly directly connected to the catastrophe we're trying to avoid. Again, another conversation. There's a lot of there's a lot of Peterson's conversations in wave 2 really revolve around these kinds of issues, and his conversation with Michael Schellenberger was sort of along that lines in terms of Apocalypse Never. And Schellenberger, again, sort of another IDW type that you would have imagined to be sort of a progressive, gets disillusioned with the woke progressive narratives and tries to find a new way to save the world by forestalling catastrophe, or basically saying, oh, there are issues in terms of climate change, but they're probably overblown and we're doing better than we think we are. And I mean, that's been a constant theme through Jordan Peterson's second wave. Now, we have limitations in this, the proximate bias that I've talked about quite a bit. Application scaling issue, which is Black Lives Matter, mobilization, suffering, and tyranny. So often we produce unintended consequences that at some point, as you saw in the Soviet Union, this massive utopian vision sort of collapses because at some point nobody believes in the darn thing anymore, and holding the thing up is just stupid, and we might as well just throw the whole thing away and try and find a new system. And that's pretty much what happened in much of the second world, which was the communist world. Now we sort of struggle against all these things, and we try to employ rationalism and direct focus of the will, but we're really not very good at that as a species. And we're still talking mostly about just catastrophe avoidance in terms of saving the world. We're paying very little attention to the regular, slow catastrophes that take us all, which I describe basically as the age of decay. We sort of forestall decay with paint and plastic surgery and medicine and statins and better material science and et cetera, but the kind of decay we can't seem to sustain, in fact, seems to be the decay of the human will, which happens to all of us. We get tired and we break down and we sort of lapse. Then, of course, there's the whole game B thinking with, I've used Brett Weinstein in terms of this, that, well, let's find the transformative technologies in order to really sustain ourselves. And, yes, smartphones, the way that smartphones went, well, we need to find absolutely pure, positive technologies just like the smartphones. And to that, you really sort of have to go back to...
There is this theme as well, I think, in sci-fi, and I wonder we've seen it with our technology already, is that we have these utopian technologies that could open the world and connect us, like the internet was, that eventually when you add humans into it, we fuck it all up by being human.
And that's really my answer to a lot of the game B thinking. This is how we are. We're trying to imagine not only catastrophe avoidance, but also some sort of transformative change. But we still have all those limitations: the suffering bias, the proximity bias, and we don't know what's good. We sort of know we need the absolute, so we absolutize in the upper register, but we can't pull it off. So for the most part, humanity backs into the future, and this is both good and bad. Like I mentioned, I've been reading Barth for Armchair Theologians. It's a very easy book if you want to know something about Karl Barth and you're not willing to wade into all sorts of technical, theological, or expensive. It's a whole book series, and I haven't read any of the other books in the series. I think I actually had this book in my Logos library anyway, so it was an easy thing to just pull up and start reading. And I thought the book was, I thought the illustrations were a little silly, but the book itself was really quite well done. Also reading this book of theologians under Hitler. That's a kind of a cool case study of, well, they get into the Weimar Republic. Why would these theologians sort of embrace Hitler? And what did they think? What were the problems that Hitler was solving? And then, of course, well, okay, Mussolini, at least the trains ran on time. But then you have the whole entire catastrophe of starting a war that you once again have your cities bombed into rubble, and a third of your country will be occupied by the Soviet Union for 50 years, and this is almost always the way of us as human beings. So for the most part, humanity backs into the future. We can't see the future, so we back into it, and the good and the bad. Major changes since the Columbian Exchange. Hardly could forecast it when Christopher Columbus is looking for a faster way to China in order to trade. Jordan Peterson, has the point that, well, things are better, and in many respects they are better. But there you have relevance realization. Which things are you looking at? Are some things better? Are some things worse? How do you make a global assessment? Now, thermonuclear war, it's fairly easy to make a global assessment that that's a really bad thing. Huge threat, and there are huge threats out there. There really are, and some major overhauls of humanity in recorded history have addressed those threats. And many small things, like the fixation of nitrogen, again, a book that I've mentioned often but haven't really read from. The Alchemy of Air talks about how, basically we're able to take nitrogen out of the atmosphere, both for artificial fertilizer and for explosives. It's a great illustrative example of that. And we're still trying to come to terms with all of these changes. And when Peterson was with the objectivists, that's a place that he made this comment that he's made in a number of other places, and I've heard other people say it. When you're working with individual human beings, you really don't get down to the basic level until you get down to the theological level. That's really how religion is so very basic in terms of an integrating framework for figuring out what is of most importance. Who are we? What is the future? What is good? What is bad? It's really religion that tries to pull all of these things together. The deepest, most permanent individual transformations happen at the theological level. And to go back to the frame stuff that I've been talking about for a number of years, God is the frame of frames. He really is. It's the most flexible frame by which we try to approximate God with a monarchical vision and looking down in modernity from everything. But scales up all the way to the absolute, scales down all the way to all the way out to the infinite, and scales down all the way to the bottom, which is the composite individual, which is what we are. Now, religions totalize in a way that secularism can't, and we saw this with respect to wokeism. Once you believe that the grave is all there is, then Hitler, Mao, and Stalin really all got away with it. And in fact, everyone gets away with everything because there's really no way to address all the kinds of things that we simply find unaddressable because we're not at the level of power or ability or knowledge to actually manage everything. Everything is far too big for us, even when we sort of scale ourselves up as institutions. Philosophy, of course, tries, and in many ways, ancient philosophies were much more like religions. Modern philosophy tries to displace religion and really has failed. Religions have a power because they break the secular frame. And religions then begin to imagine rational agents that are beyond human beings, more than just us, and that there are purposes at work in the universe which we can't begin to imagine. Now, even if all the physicalists are right, still the ability to imagine in those frames, in those ways, just as the ability to project our narratives into afterlives, I think have proven to be an adaptive change which actually enables human beings to do more. And again, it's just difficult to make the kinds of huge kind of value judgments over history with these kinds of things. Religions are simply inescapable with people. And again, my conversation with Greg Enriquez was really illuminating on that when he began to describe, he was a sold out Sam Harris fan who has now seen the value of religion on the other end of religion. And so then you begin constructing that and you sort of do it in a Protestant way. And at some point, you're probably going to want to do it in a symbolic way. I mean, Comte saw this, the father of modern sociology. He saw this and, practiced this, but very few of these things actually scale or go anywhere. In fact, the one that perhaps has done the most scaling, Scientology, we all know to be the scammiest of the bunch. And that's just an indicator of exactly how we are. Religions are fertile for human production and destruction. They can imagine individual and communal collective transformations far beyond the secular. And religions just simply have more tools. And we're seeing the abandonment of religion in the secular, and I think we're at the end of modernity going to see the abandonment, or at least the nuance of the secular back towards the religion, and it's going to be wild. This gets into Archetypos, which is archetypes. And arche is, of course, first and foremost, or highest, and the tupos are basically patterns. And we find these coming again and again. Any sufficient totalizing tool will need to include past and future. We back into the future because that's all we can do. And this is Nassim Taleb's Lindy effect, and this gives priority to the older. Now, for the most part, again, almost everything I've been talking about has been in the modern secular physicalist frame, catastrophe avoidance. How much better can we do? Well, we see those limitations as really small and incremental. And if you're in a secular frame, it's just partly simply clogged by the iron box of secularism. Christianity offers a renewed material world. In some ways, you can see this reflected in the biases of science and technology developed in Christendom. It informed the imagination. It scales individual salvation and sacrifice. It's always working the preserve, improve dynamic, and resources are available on a scale unlike any other. It's just sort of the advantage that major religions have in the world. They've already done a ton of work. And even if a lot of the ancient solutions are new to you, well, once you find the ancient solution, especially in this modern age, suddenly you have church fathers to read and church history to read and ancient texts to read and theologians to read, and you can just continue to build on an enormous tradition that has already done a ton of thinking and has tried all kinds of dead-end streets. And this is, again, for me, why trying to develop a new religion just really doesn't make sense, because so much work has been done of the old. It's sort of like trying to develop a new science. Okay, try to develop that new science and you're not going to use any of the old science. It just doesn't make any sense because you're losing the cumulative effect of everything that's gone before. And we're still talking, there's still that limitation of catastrophe avoidance. And, well, again, we have all these new utopian visions.
So there is this theme as well, I think, in sci-fi, and I wonder we've seen it with our technology already, is that we have these utopian technologies that could open the world and connect us like the internet was, that eventually when you add humans into it, we fuck it all up by being human.
And we all have to do our personal assessment and figure out where we are and what we're going to do and what we're going to put our time in. And so that's, quite frankly, why I continue to invest and believe and form and do all of this work towards the resurrection and the age to come. I don't think new technologies, new techniques, new religions finally answer the question as well as the ones we've already had with us, and when we're looking back, the ones who have brought us here. Now, again, you wind up sort of in a Jordan Peterson space where you can say, okay, well, this has gotten us here, but can you really live into it unless you really believe it? Well, what if I don't believe it? Well, what would it take to believe? Well, you're going to have to form your life, form your mind. You believe what the people you spend the most time with and listen to, and the people you esteem, you believe what they believe. That's how human beings work. Science will tell you that. History will tell you that. If you want to take part in a transformation, if you want to take part in world saving, I think this is by all means the most reasonable way to pursue it. So let me know what you think.